Shaun Murray has sparked off a fiery discussion over gaming audiences, even though it does seem like part of his point is being kinda lost. Ubisoft appear to be acting in a really scummy way with artists, and over on the gaming front, they're seemingly working hard to protect their Assassin's Creed experience boost. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Roundup, our twice per week gaming news show that keeps you up to date with the most interesting headlines and topics that are going on. And today we're going to start it off with Shaun Murray and player trust. So, speaking to PC Game Zen, Shaun Murray talked about how they handle their evolving game and its community. On player feedback, he said this, and this really did catch headlines. Players are normally almost always right about problems, they're almost never right about solutions. Now, he then goes on to mention them taking a data-driven approach, which is to take a broader view of what players like and what they dislike, and to step back and figure out if there is a common thread between those things. And he mentioned that about 70% of their patch notes are community-driven changes, meaning things that are from listening to players talking about the problems they have with the game. He said it's essential building direct communication with the players, that they provide feedback, and that the next patch has always an update or two that is addressing those pieces of valuable feedback. So overall, I think it's pretty clear how this could have been taken in a not particularly great way. How it could seem like Shaun is just looking down on the gamers, saying that they're almost always wrong with their solutions. And yeah, he probably could have worded that better. It's a little bit dramatic, and I think you can definitely see why that is the quote that was commonly mined out and the thing that really became the meme that spread. Now, that said, I think there's a bit of truth to what Shaun is saying. I think players are going to be really cognizant of the problems that they experience, because they're like, I'm playing the game, this is an obvious problem, I don't like this is a pain point. Yeah, players are going to be pretty much spot on when it comes to suggesting those things. However, I do think that sometimes players will maybe fixate on those problems and maybe try to fix them directly. I think a really good example of this is Anthem. So in Anthem, it had all of its loot problems. And for a lot of people, there was a loot bug for a period of time that led to there being a lot more loot in the game. It was spawning at a higher rate. And there was a sort of big campaign to essentially keep this bugged higher amount of loot. And I completely understand why. The problem with that game was there wasn't rewarding loot. It did not drop enough. So a thing happens that makes the loot drop more. There we go. Problem solved. Not really though, because the core fundamental problem of Anthem's loot isn't really the drop rate, it's that the loot is fundamentally badly designed. So if you just make that same badly designed loot drop a lot more often, you're putting a bandage, or I think a band-aid, you're sort of painting over the problem, when really all you've done is you fixed the symptom of the problem. You've not actually fixed the root cause. And I think that's essentially what Shaun was trying to get at there. I think he could have made that point in a more diplomatic way and a lot better. It is very clear that he understands the community aspect. In this, he did talk about how so many of their changes are directly inspired by the community, and that does mean that they're listening and they're adapting to what the community say. I think that's just a bit of a whoopsie with the communication, although I think his point is a very interesting one to discuss. Anyhow, moving on, and still in Shaun Murray news, there is a little bit more from his appearance at Develop, where he spoke about their experiences in speaking about No Man's Sky to press and to players, especially just before and after release. And this is a super interesting topic, given everything that happened with that game. And it was quite an interesting discussion, because he was talking about when he sits down and talks to a journalist, he's talking to another person that, ideally should know a lot about the industry and have all of that context. And that means that when he's talking openly about those things, in a lot of cases, he sort of would have gotten himself into trouble, because that would not have been necessarily properly communicated once it actually got out of the interview and into the wider press. And he actually said that it, quote, kind of kills him that sometimes games journalists don't do a good job of educating their audiences on game development and what's actually going on behind the veil. And I think that's an interesting point, because there's a little bit of fault everywhere here. I think a lot of the game journalists, and I think a lot of the game pundits, do a pretty poor job of explaining things within the context of how software development actually works. Because that is what a lot of game development is. It is software development. So I think a lot of them do a pretty bad job. But equally, Shaun Murray did an awful job in being aware of that happening. Now, he does seem to be aware that he did a pretty bad job of that, and that seems to be why they went into their media blackout, where they just focused on releasing the content. But overall, I do think it is pretty important that game journos and just people who cover games try a bit harder. So going back to, say, the whole Unity asset flip thing, that was very poorly handled by a lot of the game pundits who were covering that story. I think anyone who's actually, doing game development would have seen that and thought, this is pretty bad coverage. Because when most game developers think of the asset store, they're thinking about prototype assets. They're thinking about maybe a camera plugin, a sound plugin, maybe Shader Forge or something like that, which is in the Unity asset store, or some like back-end stuff, a text processing system like Text Mesh 2D, things that would not have been covered that way, that a lot of those journalists really should have done. Well, I'd say journalists, pundits, the whole lot of them should have done a lot more to cover correctly. There's a lot of things with, say, some coverage of the creation engine, where there's a lot of people willfully being wrong about how game engines work to drum up a little bit more controversy. And I think that some of that stuff is pretty irresponsible. And when Shaun Murray says it kind of kills him to see that lack of an attempt to educate on game development issues, yeah, that kind of kills me too sometimes. And actually, that's one of the main reasons why I started this channel, because I was simultaneously not particularly happy. I basically just wasn't that happy with the state of game coverage, and that's why it exists. So I think it's a very interesting topic here. But then, of course, the other side of this is, it's not the consumer's job to have a full understanding of all of those things. I suppose what I would say is that when you, for, your coverage of something, are bringing those elements in, yeah, there is a bit of a burden to actually explain them in the proper context, not take things out of context to make stuff a little bit more sensational. But that said, going back to the core stuff of the press communications with No Man's Sky, that was a clear instance of the press kind of lost the run of themselves, like not really fact-checking him that much, not really pushing Shaun Murray on how realistic are all of these things, even though those people, being experienced games journalists, they will have known that a lot of what Shaun was saying was probably not going to happen for launch. But ultimately then, Shaun also would have known what was happening with the game, and he did have a responsibility to not lose the run of himself, and, and that's me taking things, I suppose, all of his stuff being in good faith. Yeah, he has a responsibility to not poorly communicate in a way that would mislead people. Of course, it is always possible that they, purposefully misled people, but I think that's something that could go either way, and seeing how they responded to that game after launch, where they stuck with it and did not further monetize it and just worked on free updates, I'm going to say that I think they were doing that stuff in good faith, but made stupid mistakes. Now, he did go on to say that essentially positive stories don't do as well, and I think that pretty much is right, because generally, if there's a negative story, it's like, it's something that's worth you being worried about, so you're going to find out what it is, because it could be, a threat or a problem, and you want to be on top of that. But I suppose with No Man's Sky, like, one of our best videos was a positive No Man's Sky video. I think in that case, it's because there's a compelling story there of a redemption arc, because they went so low at the beginning and then pretty much did grind in the free updates. So that was very interesting. Now, overall, he does seem to have come around to, I think, an agreeable position. He said that they focus on the, quote, real purity of speaking to players through the game. And he said, if you want to communicate, you've got to do an update. You've got to release something. And that's quite interesting, because it's basically him, and he later said this to Games Radar, that it's far more about what your actions are rather than what your words are. So typically, whenever they've been doing communications for No Man's Sky, it's alongside an update that has tangible things that are specifically communicated. And I think it's quite interesting. One thing you can see from No Man's Sky being a bit of a turnaround story is that while this is maybe not the ideal communication method for everybody, it certainly seems to have worked for them. So I suppose it's an interesting personal arc with Shaun Murray saying your actions are so much more important than what you say. And I think if there's anything to learn from how No Man's Sky came into the world, I think it pretty much is that. Then next, we've got Assassin's Creed Odyssey being back in the news. So just recently, they introduced the Story Creator. Now, this would allow players to basically use some tools to build custom story missions and then share them with other players. Now, that's a really cool thing actually, but it has been used to create missions that grant you easy XP, and Ubisoft did not like that. They're going to be changing the mode to stop those stories from being published, they're going to be hiding existing ones from recommendations, as well as implementing undisclosed sanctions for players who continue to use those missions to farm XP. Now, the main reason they offered is that it was supposed to be a tool to let people be creative and be imaginative, and that the exploit stories threaten that by taking the limelight away from the better quality content that they want to see on their platform. And on face value, that seems reasonable, but in context, there are some issues. What they did not mention is that the XP farming quests seem to be a reaction to the game having a pretty bad leveling experience. At launch, many reviewers and players, including myself, were talking about the slow, grindy leveling being combined with level gating, and that hurting the game quite severely, especially as you get to the level gate in the end game. Now, this has been alleviated by the addition of some level scaling and some smaller improvements that do make the main questline a lot smoother, but that stuff happened months after launch, after the money was made. Now, the end game still has pretty lofty goals for XP gain. Now, this whole experience can be improved massively with the purchase of a permanent XP booster in their shop labeled as a time saver. Yes, $10 more, you can get a number tweaked, you will get 50% bonus XP, and the game, and I can say this from experience, will feel a lot better to play. Of course, Ubisoft neglected to mention these incentives when they discussed their reasoning for removing the XP farming missions. And really, I think what this does is it just calls the whole thing into question, because frankly, their original reasoning, if none of those other incentives existed, would make sense. You want your story creator to be there to show really cool stories. I suppose it would be like Mario Maker and maybe Nintendo wanting to sort of hide the meme levels and, really push up the levels that were actually really, really good Mario levels, not ones that are just super hard for the sake of being hard. Now that, does make sense, but the thing is, it's not in isolation, is it? And this is a game that I think a lot of people would say was purposefully made grindy in order to make its experience boost time saver seem more alluring to players. And that really does just completely throw a lot of their original reasoning out the window. It's true that they have a business incentive to keep this game being a little bit more grindy, and when something like this happens, it undermines that business reason, and yeah, in this case, they kill it. Previous ways to sort of, have a creative use of game mechanics to to level up fast in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, they did patch those out. They were quite quick in fixing those things. And you gotta wonder, were they so quick in fixing those things? Because ultimately, it hurt their bottom line, and that $10 XP boost is an important part of their bottom line. And I suppose you could say that even if Assassin's Creed Odyssey is on a discount heavily a year after release, well, if it still has that really grindy balancing, guess what? They're probably not going to be discounting that $10 XP boost, are they? So that's kind of like I guess it's a part of their game's pricing structure that's not going to be decreasing over time. So overall, the whole thing's just really fishy to me, and it's such a sad thing, because if they did not have that XP boost, if this game had have been well balanced, then it really would have been a winning story. It would have launched being a really solid RPG. It would have had really good support with a lot of DLC that was apparently pretty decent, and it would have had the story creator, which is a genuinely fantastic thing to have in the game. But unfortunately, their business model decisions have really corrupted a lot of that, and they do force you, as I think if you're going to be a skeptical and a responsible consumer, they do force you to question some of the reasoning, and it is really sad that the genuinely good art in this game is, being a little bit polluted by those business things. And really, that intersection of art and business perfectly leads us on to the next story. Also in the Ubisoft realm, we have Watch Dogs Legion's team getting into a bit of hot water. So Ubisoft have again partnered with Hit Record, which is actor Joseph Gordon-Levitt's music production company, and this time they're asking for community-made music to augment the game's soundtrack. And they're asking for, well, basically, they want 10 of the best tracks to be added to the game, and the people who provide those tracks will be rewarded with $2,000. Now, the thing is, this process works kind of akin to spec work or speculative work, in which an artist is tasked to create a demo or a full piece, be it music or visuals, and then present it to a company. And then if that piece is deemed usable in the project, they get paid for it. Now, the worst case of this is when it's just abused to get free demos or free labor essentially from artists instead of having to actually just pay professionals for a full salary. Now, back when Ubisoft and Hit Record partnered on Beyond Good and Evil 2 for music and art, Joseph Gordon-Levitt defended Hit Record and Ubisoft by outlining that they work somewhat differently, being more community focused and paying out anyone whose contribution was used, inviting collaboration. But the thing is that his words there, I mean, they don't really go to, address the main concern. A AAA game developer is asking, it's crowdsourcing submissions for work to be used in the game, and if that work happens to be used, they will pay what seems to be a lot less than the going industry rate. In fact, this could be seen as a very similar situation to developers being mistreated and underpaid in the guise of passion. I mean, we've all heard those stories from Blizzard. Now, Mike Bithell tweeted about this, of course, from Thomas Was Alone and a bunch of other games. Now, he tends to, be pretty vocal when it comes to independent creators and their treatment and stuff like that. Now, Mike said that Ubisoft should do better, and they should stop exploiting fans and hobbyists because that is pretty disrespectful to them and it devalues the work of professionals. Now that said, there is a bit of a counterpoint. Sebastian Wolf, a musician in games and the founder of the Materia Collective, which is a games music label, also spoke out about this with a different perspective. He said it's a potential opportunity. It's not for everyone, but there definitely are positives to engaging in something with a high potential for exposure and recognition. And I think there's a bit of truth there, although paid with exposure, rightly so, is a pretty negative meme. Now, if taking that risk of, putting in the work without guaranteed pay is viable to you, then he says it might be worth a potential return. It will be a demo submitted to pros in the AAA world, so it could be a good foot in the door. However, if absolutely getting paid for your work is a priority, it's basically a terrible idea for you. And he pointed out that these things may be great opportunities for some people, and that condemning it because it doesn't fit the needs of most people, that is not really appropriate. Now, Ubisoft have weighed in on the controversy too, with an FAQ explaining the finer details and saying that they're doing this as an opportunity to add some community flavor to the game, saying that it's fitting with the theme of Legion and, the NPCs being a part of the story, and that they want to get that community collaboration instead of farming it out to cheap labor to fill out the soundtrack. And to be honest with you, I really disagree with this, because think about our game, us being an indie with not that much in the way of funding. I could just go to my other YouTube channel, which is almost at 500,000 subs, and I could just ask for people to submit music for our game. But that wouldn't feel right to me for all the reasons I've laid out here. On our game, we found an artist who we liked, we went through the design process together, and that whole thing was a paid gig. Fundamentally, for me, if you want people to do work, you've got to be willing to pay for the work. Otherwise, it's pretty disrespectful. To me, this whole thing seems like far more just soliciting a lot more than 20 grand of labor while only paying 20 grand. So it does come off to be really scummy. And frankly, it's destroyed by this. How about you just ask community artists to submit their already existing portfolios and follow up with the people who you like and commission them to do work based on their portfolios because you think it matches the community style you want, the community flavor you want for Legion. If that was purely the goal, that would be the way to do it, and you'd still be paying the people fairly, and you wouldn't be soliciting a stupid amount of work from a massive number of people, the vast majority of whom that work's just going to disappear into oblivion, into the void. But anyway, that will do us for another roundup. Yeah, covering some older stories. Of course, I was away in Majorca. We were a little bit behind schedule, but I think these were really interesting topics. They're ideas based. I think they're pretty cool. So, what do you think about Ubisoft? Do you think they're up to no good, or do you think they're being genuine here? What do you think about Shaun Murray? Do you think he was taken sort of unfairly out of context? Do you think it was his communication whoopsie? What do you think of his core point? I'd really love to know, so please let me know down in those comments. And with all of that said, thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.